Hey there, guys. I'm Shammy, and today we're gonna read Columbine by Dave Cullen. Well, at least in that first 19 chapters. And I'm only going to go through the most important parts. So let's start off. After an hour of revelry, the short middle-aged man strode across the gleaming basketball court to address his student body. This is talking about Mr. D, the principal, and then we already know that he doesn't hold back, and then he feels really sad, and then he says that he wants everybody back on Monday morning without knowing that on Tuesday there would be a huge massacre at the school. And then we move on to the second chapter where we're talking about Eric and Dylan. That Eric and Dylan were really smart people, but then Eric was a cooler person, even despite being shorter than Dylan and stuff like that. And that Eric liked to get chicks, lots and lots of chicks, and then we learned that he is all American, but still he really loves to listen to German things, and he really likes Nazi stuff, so he's into that. And then the most one of the most important parts is that his smile was his trump card, bashful and earnest yet flirtatious. And then we learn about Dylan, who was characterized as meek, self-conscious, and authentically shy. And we talked about like him having a date to the prom, and Eric not having a prom date and stuff like that. Mm. And then we learned that Dylan's girlfriend was the one that supplied three of the four guns that the Dylan and Eric used in the shooting. And then we learned that Eric and Dylan were actually pretty big on their Columbine school stuff, like football games, dances, variety shows, and different things like that. And then we learned that they work at Blackjack Pizza, and then they shot bottle rockets and stuff, that they really had lots of fun. And we also learned that Eric has a nickname, and that's Reb, based because he's so rebellious that he named himself Reb. So like a rebel after the school mascot. And then Dylan went by vodka, which was his favorite liquor. And we learned that these guys are heavy smokers, heavy drinkers, and they would down bottles and a lot of it. And we also learned that Dylan is incredibly unreliable and stuff like that. But when it comes to acting, Dylan was actually a more engaging actor than Eric. So we learn about that they were shooting, and this is in correlation with the basement tapes. And then we learn about where Columbine is located, and it's located on Rebel Hills Mesa, and this is in Colorado. And then we talk about how there's 250,000 square feet of solid no frills construction is Columbine High School. And then we learned that Eric and Dylan were heavy smokers right now, and that they like Camel and that. Don't know if that's important, but it's still pretty much important. And then one time we have this encounter with Eric. He says, I hate almost everyone. Ah, yes, I want to rip his head off and eat it." And that shows how his voice was pretty flat, no malice, no anger, barely interested. And they don't notice these small changes within Eric, that he's somehow going to do something that is really going to be the peak for 1999. And then we learned that the cafeteria is uh commons. Then we learn of A and B lunch and all of that. We also learn about the surveillance cameras that would be catching the footage of these two shooters later. And we have one of our important vocab words, banal. It means to be bare or disinteresting. And then we move on to talking about the history behind these shootings. We learned that in 1999 there was actually no shooting until these guys planned it, which ended a streak. And then we learned that Eric and Dylan, their blackjack job actually gave them a lot of revenue to fund bomb production, weapons acquisition, napalm experiments. And we learned that they had no intention of graduating. That Eric had zero intention, but Dylan's parents flew to the University of Arizona and they really liked it. They were going to put him inside of the University of Arizona and they were going to mail his deposit on Monday, the day before they start. So everything is actually related in the timeline. And then we learned that they have new owners and then they ask for advances against what they've already worked, which shows that these guys were really desperate and that they really needed the money. Then we learned that Eric was really into all of this German stuff like Nietzsche, Freud, Hitler, German industrial bands like Rammstein, KMFDM, and he liked to follow his high fives with Sieg Heil or Heil Hitler. And this is definitely showing signs of they're not mentally stable. And we learned that Eric, well, Eric's weak point is rejection, and then he has an actual list of young girls who did not like him, and he really has that input of hatred for others. And we move on to chapter 5, where we learn about the Columbine Lounge. It's a strip mall type of club gig that was started in the 1970s, and it's pretty cool. And then we learn about old and new Columbine. But then we have the majority of new Columbine. It seems to be the majority. They're separated by their beliefs, as in like going out to these lounges and stuff. And we learn a little bit of history with Columbine that it was built in 1973 and stuff like that. And we learned that 100,000 new arrivals would fill this one continuous suburb. And we get one of our rhetorical devices, which is digression. It's where a temporary change of subject from main topic so that we could actually not get bored within this. We learn about Dave Sanders. He's the basketball coach and he coaches 7 other sports and stuff. And so he's a pretty practical guy. He raises his daughter in the gym and stuff like that. And Angela says, I grew up at Columbine, she said. Dave was widening out into a big bear of a man, and when he hugged Angela, she felt safe. This shows like how each character's like feelings are in this, even despite this being a real thing. We actually understand that it's kind of introduced to us as a story. And then we learned about Dave Sanders' marriage, that he had a happy divorce and stuff like that. And then he accepts to adopt two of his second wife, Linda Lou's children. And then we learn of his changes, and then he gets new glasses and nobody notices. So like there's like these small changes that we notice that is not too directly related to Columbine itself, but it's to help ease it in. And then we have stuff about prom, that it's April 17th, and everybody was questioning each other. And we get one of our other characters, Patrick Ireland. He, and then we get his love life and stuff about his first love, his first girlfriend in third grade, who was Laura. And then we learn that Patrick asked Cora because he didn't have the guts to ask Laura, and that's pretty weird. And then we learn about Cassie Bernal, who's actually one of the girls who gets shot. And then we learn that she was just a loser, according to herself. That she just moves on that way. And then we talk about Robin Anderson and yeah, how they're going to prom and stuff. And then we learned this chilling quote. Dylan looked at his dad through the lens. Dad, we're going to be laughing about this in 20 years. And that's really chilling because he wouldn't be alive within the next week. And then we learned that Dylan was in a great mood to get to the prom and stuff. And then he says, we've got to stay in touch, he insisted. This group was too fun to let go. And that's also pretty crazy considering what he's gonna do later. And then we learn about that Dylan actually wishes that he could be going to college and worries about his future, and then he kept saying that he could hardly wait, despite knowing that there would be no future for him. That's really sad. And we learned about the church in the Columbine area. And we talk about the Trinity Christian Center, where they believe there's an enemy to repel, and that plausible enemy could have been, who knows, maybe it could have been our Eric and Dylan, but this is how all of these are interconnected. Then we learn about how there was a Waco, Texas bomb blast between this Davidian cult and FBI. And then we talk about how Eric and Dylan wish to do worse than that. Eric dreamed much bigger than what they would have done with McVeigh in Waco, Texas. He says he calls it Judgment Day. Eric designed at least 7 big bombs working off the anarchist cookbook he found on the web. And the boys were going to double or triple McVeigh's record. They estimated damage variously as hundreds, several hundred, and at least 400. Oddly conservative for the arsenal they were preparing. And then Eric has a decoy plan where he's going to put a bomb next to his house so that the police get distracted and they can do their job at the school. And there's 3 acts to this um, event that they call the Judgment Day, which is very scary in itself. And it's compared to a movie that makes it even more chilling. And then Dylan doesn't really like this killing aspect. Eric loves it, he enjoys it. And then we learn about Act 1 that they were going to use as a decoy in a park. They're just going to keep it there and then just run away. And then Act 2 would be firing times. Oh, I skipped the part. They would actually put some bombs in the cafeteria so that as it blasts and some children are escaping, they would be right behind with semi-autos and shotguns. And they saw the barrels of the shotguns for concealment. And they'd carry 80 portable explosives between themselves. So that's about 40 a person. So that's a lot. And they have supply of Molotov cocktails and an assortment of freakish knives. And that is even more crazier. Then every detail was planned. Battle positions were imperative. And Eric and Dylan were really savoring Act 3, that their maximum body count would be nearly 2,000 students plus 150 staff, faculty, and staff, plus who knows how many police, paramedics, and journalists. And they had been considering a killing spree for at least a year and a half. And then they had settled on Monday, April 19th, but because of some plans that had toppled, they had to move it to Tuesday. And then we learned that there were many handwritten timelines showing the bomb scheduled to explode between 11:16 and 11:18, uh, followed by little quips called "Have fun" and "Ha ha ha." And the date was the first element of Eric's plan to fail, apparently because of ammo. So they had to switch it because he wanted more, and he's really ruthless here. So they go to a guy's house, Michael Maines. He's a drug dealer, and they get a gun and then some magazines from him. And then we continue on to chapter 9, dads, and then we see Mr. D and then Frank talking. And then they have a little close conversation where Dave asking, do you miss coaching? And then Frank saying, not really, which surprises Dave. And then we move on to talking about their life and how and what goes on. And we learn about that in the morning, Linda and Dave were both in a rush and stuff. And then we move on to chapter 10, Judgment. And then we learn that Eric and Dylan woke up at 5:30, and Dylan leaves his house and then calls out bye to his parents. And then Eric says, make today count, under the heading of the day planner with a blazing gun barrel. That is very chill, guys. That's not cool at all. And then they return to Eric's house at 7 o'clock and then split up. Eric fills the propane tanks and Dylan got the gasoline. They allotted half an hour to pick up the big bombs, assemble them, and then set up the cars, and an hour for the last round of gear up, practice, and chill. They got something to eat. Dylan apparently had potato skins. And then we learned that their chill time had actually gone too far long. It had gone perilously over schedule. Shortly before 11 a.m., Eric and Dylan set off the arsenal. Dylan was wearing cargo pants, a black t-shirt printed with wrath, and his Red Sox cap. And Eric's teacher said natural selection. How ironic, guys. They had planned this even down to the t-shirts itself. And then we see that 11:10 Eric pulls up into the parking lot, and then we move out. And then we see Brooks Brown, who walked out for a cigarette and sees Eric. And then Eric says, Brooks, I like you now. Get out of here. Go home. And that really must have confused Brooks and everybody, us, technically, because he's warning him to get out of the school. And Eric's other friend, Nate Dykeman, he also leaves. And we see them going inside. Shortly after 11:14, they entered the commons. They moved inconspicuously enough to go unnoticed. No, not one of the 500 witnesses noticed them or the big bulky bags. And then we move on And then learning that each boy has a semi-automatic, a shotgun, and a backpack full of pipe bombs and crickets. And then we learned that surveillance cameras should have caught image of these guys, but unfortunately, the custodian went a little bit too much. He took too long, so they couldn't really notice the children. Moving on, we see that we learn about Columbine's bell schedule, and then we see that Mr. D was actually absent on this day, unfortunately. So he was sitting in his office waiting for a young teacher to arrive. And then we see that uh, Deputy Neil Gardner, the community resource officer, was assigned to Columbine, and a lunch was his time. Then we learned that unfortunately the decoy that Eric used was one of his dumber ideas because it didn't work, and they knew that each car was positioned for a perfect view. The cafeteria would explode in front of them. They would watch their classmates be torn apart and incinerated and their school burning to the ground. No one observed what happened next during Act 2. So this part is around at 11:18. And then Eric and Dylan move quickly through this. This is chapter 11 if you know that. Then we hear Eric open firing at around 11:19. And we see Dylan cheering him on, but Dylan doesn't fire at all. Well, mostly. And then we see going outside that there are these students, Lance Kirkland and Sean Graves and Danny, who all think that it's a paintball game or a senior prank, and then Danny goes and then he hits the concrete sidewalk, gets shot, and then death was almost instantaneous. Lance went out on the grass, but he continued to breathe. Sean burst out laughing, and he felt a short shot zip by his neck, and he felt a couple of pricks like an IV needle being pulled out. He was shot. And then Lance tried to regained consciousness. He reached up toward the guy, tugged on his pant, and cried for help. Sure, I'll help, the gunman said. The wait seemed like forever to Lance. Then we see a janitor come by and reassure Sean. And then we go through and then we find that Sean was playing dead and that Dylan falls for it, or at least he pretends to. Now we hear that Coach Sanders is alerted about the danger and then he was trying to save the kids. And then he says run. And then all the students run in three, and then all the students run towards the tables, and then they feel a lot safer there. And then there's a lot of shouting, saying, "There's a gun!" And then we hear this maybe a little funny part that in room three, students were immersed in a chemistry test. They heard something like rocks being thrown against the windows, but the teacher assumed it was a prank. Stay seated and concentrate on your test, he said. So none of these people are taking it as seriously as we would today. And then Dylan was an easy firing range in the cafeteria, but he actually does not fire or throw pipe bombs at all. And we actually don't know why Dylan made his cafeteria excursion, because people assumed that he didn't know what was wrong with the bombs, but then he didn't go too far inside because if it bursted, then he would get killed. And we learned that Dylan and Eric fired at distant targets, but Dylan's Total shot count was 5. Meanwhile, Eric's is very, very high, like 40 or something. This was at 11:23. And then the first 911 call comes through to Jeffco, and they say, and then they say female down. And then we have this Nielsen, uh, this part-time art teacher, and she thinks that this is just a prank, and then she goes up to them, and then she was about to go up to them and tell them to cut it, but they then as soon as she went there, Eric started shooting at them, and then she starts screaming, "Dear God, dear God, dear God!" And then she turns to run, and then he fires again, and then Nielsen gets off safely into the library and then warns all the kids that there's a kid with a gun. And then 11:24, so the outside ordeal lasted 5 minutes. Eric did most of the shooting. He fired his rifle 47 times, but Dylan only fired 3 times. And they're both in this together, but somehow Dylan is kind of being forced into this. And then we get chapter 12, the perimeter. At 11:54 Denver time, CNN cuts from NATO and Kosovo areas about the American warplanes and stuff to this part about Jeffco, where there's Columbine shooting. And many students start giving up on 911 calls and start calling the TV stations. Local anchors began interviewing them on live TV and air, and the cable networks picked up their feeds. Witnesses confirm many injuries, and a girl says that she saw like 3 people shot. And then continuing on, we see this creepy quote. They were just shooting. They didn't care who they shot at. They were just shooting, and then they threw away a grenade or they threw something that blew up. And this is really, really scary. And then all people, we learn some identities of the shooters. All boys, all white, all Columbine students. Some were shooting in the parking lot, some in the cafeteria, some upstairs, somebody positioned on the roof. Some of the assault team wore t-shirts, others in long black trench coats. One pair included one of each. Some had hats. One or two were hiding behind ski masks. And this was just standard crime scene confusion. And the school's location on a hill allowed Eric and Dylan to be seen upstairs and downstairs almost simultaneously. The long-range weapon scattered gunfire over a shooting radius hundreds of yards wide, and we have distant witnesses who have no idea where the shooters were, but they were scared of the constant attack. Then we see that word shifts through the Columbine community really, really fast. And then Deputy Gardner unleashed female down in a frenzy of police radio traffic, hence the female down of this entire section. Moving on to Deputy Paul Smoker, who hears a kid say the shooter was Ned Harris, because they're not hearing this straight, they're just trying to get to a crime scene. And we have lots of confusion here. And then many kids were describing these gunmen in black trench coats shooting Uzis or shotguns and throwing hand grenades. And kids keep on arriving because they're trying to escape all this place. And then they were already setting up a perimeter. Every cop was setting a perimeter. And Eric has exchanged fire with 2 deputies at 11:24 and 11:26 a.m., 5 and 7 minutes into the attack. Law enforcement would not fire on the killers again or advance onto the building until shortly after noon. So this is a really long time period. And then we learn about one bleeding to death. Then we hear students saying like kids were piling into houses, and 150, 200 kids piled into this one house. Then people just try to randomly just escape into this because they have no idea what's going on. Then we get this small short cut scene about Misty Bernal hoping to find her kid Cassie Bernal, but unfortunately we already know that she's no longer alive. And then we get this guy, uh, sheriff's looking guy, John Stone, and then he's coming through. And then we see a first SWAT team in approach at approximately 12:06. The second half of a dozen of the SWAT teams go in, and additional SWAT members also arrive later. And we learn that they open rifle fire into this without even knowing what's going on. And we learned that on the west side that the gunmen were actually completely active. And then we see half a dozen bodies near the lawn and the cafeteria, and we see that many of them actually showed signs of life. And then Eric appears in the second floor window library and then fired on two deputies, and then two shot back. Others laid down suppressive fire. Paramedics got three students out. Danny was pronounced dead and left behind. At 1:15, a second SWAT team goes in. But before that, half an hour earlier, we see that Richard Castaldo is saved and Rachel Scott is saved. And then they find Danny Rorbo, and then not knowing that he's already dead, they try to rescue him, but then they just leave him on the sidewalk. The SWAT teams are actually shocked to discover that dozens of terrified students, staff were actually crouched into storage closets, and teachers had tried to climb into ceiling tiles and stuff. And then we see multiple choppers coming in because they're really scared of where these children are and where the gunmen are. And then we get the small cutscene of Nate Dykeman, who is terrified of who was responsible. Now he comes to the conclusion that Dylan and Eric were the ones that are doing this. And then we learn around 12:30, so going back, that the story takes its first grisly turn. It was so awful, so much blood. It was hard to identify the injuries. And then we move to chapter 14, which is a hostage standoff, because they had no idea if they're held captive or if they're just randomly shooting them down. And then we have all of America trying to watching almost witnessing the mass murder, and then the cameras, well, what the cameras were showing us was misleading. An army of police held at bay suggested equivalent force inside. Historical witnesses corroborated the image describing wildly different assault. Killers seemed to be everywhere, but there were only two. So this is kind of mass hysteria and everybody's scared, so I have no idea what's going on. And then the cops find Eric and Dylan's stuff. We see at the Harris place, the detectives arrive at 1:15, and then the cops smell the gas in Eric's room. They find a sawed-off shotgun barrel, unspent ammunition on the book, fingerprints, fingertips cut off, gloves on the floor, and fireworks and bomb materials on the desk, the dresser, the windowsill, and the wall, and many other places. Elsewhere, they discovered a page from the anarchist cookbook. And then we learned that an evidence specialist comes and spends 4 hours shooting 7 rolls of film. It's very crazy. And then the cops find pipe bombs in Dylan's house, but they don't find any weapons. And then uh, Dylan's dad assures that if there was any problem, that Dylan would definitely tell his dad. But they're still very confused. We learned that the first FBI agent was Agent Fuselier, who's who was the one that took care of the Waco, Texas shootout, or burning, or bomb, whatever you might want to call it. And we learned that he's a little stoic, and then as in he's pretty strong-willed and stuff. And then Fuselier is here not because he wants to be, but then he learns that his kid is actually inside. And then we learn about Chris Morris reporting himself to 911, and he talks about that he knows Eric and Dylan have guns, and they'd been messing with pipe bombs, and then he tells them all of this, and pretty soon he was surrounded by detectives, and he was arrested. So it was a very scary time to be Eric or Dylan's friends because everybody was arrested for no reason. Moving on to chapter 16, we learned that the girls that Mr. D was talking to say that Eric and Dylan were laughing and giggling and getting ready to walk right into it. The killers fired this trophy case behind Mr. D shattered, and then he said that he assumed he was a dead man. And then he tells all the girls to turn back. And now we're going on to the next part where we learn that Mr. D takes his girls over the fence, and then he finds diagrams for SWAT things. And then we have extreme detail about Patrick Ireland, and he had taken refuge under the table, and then Dylan saw him and then shot him again and again. Then Patrick went blank. He had several buckshot fragments and then wood splinters and everything onto himself. And then we learned that Patrick was paralyzed on the right side. And then Mackay and Dan, his friends, tried to drag him. And then Patrick woke up on the floor again. And he just learns that half his body couldn't get up. So he tries really, really hard. It took him 3 hours to make it to a light, to a window, hoping that someone could just see him. But, and then he hears voices that say, "Stay there, we're gonna get you." And then they say, "It's okay, it's safe, go ahead and jump." Patrick collapses because half his body is paralyzed. And then he lands on top of the truck, and then a SWAT officer picks him up, and then he was taken off. And then we learned that they ask uh what his name is, where he is, and what's his birthday. And he knew all the answers, but very slowly, because he is it's hard for him to talk. Speech was a problem now, because only a side of his mouth could move, because he'd been shot with a shotgun. And so his name is mispronounced as Rick Ireland, and that causes great confusion. And then we learned that Patrick's parents, we learned that Patrick's parents know that learned that their child is okay, that he's at the hospital. And then at 2:47, we hear news choppers come in, and anchors and TV audience perplexed of where were some random kids coming from out of the cafeteria doors. And then we learn in chapter 17 that some people like Lisa Crute is rushed to the Denver Health Medical Center, and most of the bodies were under tables. The victims had been attempting to hide. Two bodies were different. They lay open, weapons by their sides. Suicides, clearly. The SWAT team had descriptions of Eric and Dylan. These two looked like a match. And we learned that they both suicided, and that was the end of it. And then we learned that the SWAT team's investigation was too big, because they kept asking you, who are you, where were you, what did you see, and everything. And then we learned that the shooters were already in the criminal system, because they'd been arrested in their junior year for breaking into vans to steal electronic equipment. They'd actually entered a 12-month juvenile diversion program, and they'd completed the program with glowing reviews 3 months before the massacre. That's really crazy. And then there were warrants typed up in golden, sent out to the killers' homes, and to be exercised within 4 hours of the first shots. And we get a search warrant and a duplicate for Eric and Dylan's house. And they identify and actually write that Harris and / Klebold as the gunman. And then we have Fusilia asking the Jeff command how he could help, because he knows that his son is in there and he desperately needs to help. And then we hear random newspapers proclaiming 25 dead in Colorado and stuff like that. And then a reporter asks John Stone, the sheriff, for why there were so many casualties, why this happened, and he just said craziness, but that's actually wrong. That's very, very wrong. And they learn about, and then we have a part about Robin Anderson, and that she goes to the police and talks about it. And the cops actually didn't know about anything, and Robin plays it cool, not saying anything about her prom date being the mass murderer. And she tells, she talks to Zach Heckler, who didn't know anything about the guns, but then he knew that they had been making pipe bombs. Then we also know about uh this kid named Doran who worked at Blackjack, and then he hears Eric and Dylan talking about bowling pins and maybe an AK-47. So that's something a little weird. And then Robin actually has tons of stress right here. She can't handle it alone, so she calls her best friend Kelly, and they talk, and then she tells her friend about a favor that she had done for Eric and Dylan. And then she talks about the Tanner Gun Show where Eric and Dylan purchased 3 of the 4 guns. Then we move on to chapter 18. It's the last bus. And then we have lots of worried parents, and the wait goes on for a really, 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 really long time. And then there's buses and buses of students just coming. And Mr. D, he stays with the families to ensure that they're okay, stuff. And then 19, vacuuming. We learn of Dave Sanders and that he is one of the teachers that was unaccounted for. He was still in science room 3, and then reached him still alive, but he bled to death before they could rescue him. And then there and then it cuts back to Linda with her friends and everybody that she knows, because they have no idea if he's been saved, if Dave Sanders has been saved or not. And then we have lots of people talking about blood was everywhere, it was just terrible, and all the horrible things that happened. And then we hear about Brad and Misty Bernal, and then they don't actually get notified that their child is actually dead. And that ends our chapter 1 through 19 summary.